Conditioning Toward Extinction, a program from the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions in Santa Barbara. This is one in a series of programs developed from a center conference held to discuss the theories of B.F. Skinner, author of the best-selling book Beyond Freedom and Dignity. As this program begins, Arthur R. Jensen points out that genetic and other differences in individuals could pose a problem for a behaviorist who is trying to redesign an entire culture, and he asks how behaviorists might deal with this problem.
Anyone planning a society or a culture or redesigning an already existing social system, I think eventually has to face most of the major problems that already exist in the society that he wishes to redesign through operant techniques. And I believe that one of the large existing problems in society today has to do with the vast range of individual differences that exist in socially relevant traits. Now, if these differences are all a result of environmental contingencies, then there's no major problem that the operant conditioner has to face, really, because the question of individual differences comes under the purview of dealing with shaping behavior from birth on through operant techniques. However, if these differences are also associated with the wiring of individuals that comes with them at the time of birth through genetic mechanisms and the like, and these differences are not highly amenable to operant techniques, then one would like to know what the operant culture designer, how he regards this particular problem area.
The next speaker is Halleck Hoffman, Dean of the School of Critical Studies, California Institute of the Arts.
In a way, I think we have all been saying that operant conditioning, if it is true, and there does not seem to be much argument about the fact that the statements about it are true, are like things that are true about us genetically. In fact, they have been affecting the way we act all along. And the same thing seems to me to be true about operant conditioning. It has been going on all along. When the literature of freedom and dignity had not yet been written, the fact of operant conditioning was present in the world and was taking place. And the literature of freedom and dignity has arisen in the context of a set of creatures who live together, who learn fairly effectively, who talk, who use tools, and so forth, and among other things, have genetic dispositions to do certain kinds of things. One of those genetic dispositions is to be conditioned operantly. I think it's going to take us a very long time to figure out exactly what it all means, just as I think it's been astonishing that it has taken us all this time to begin to have some appreciation of what the genetic factors that Jensen is talking about really mean.
The next point is offered by Alexander Comfort, medical biologist and director of aging research at University College London.
Operant conditioning is one of the very few ideologies, if I can call it that, though it isn't really an ideology, which substitutes reinforcement for hostility. And this is a very important sieve against certain types of personality getting into office, nuts like aversive techniques. I think it could get its constituency. I think it would get it by a fusion between the growing environmental threats, the anger of the public over irresponsible policies in industry and politics, mutinies against overseas wars, the unmanageability of urban problems, which is getting worse and worse everywhere, a basic wish here of Americans to avoid unproductive civil violence, which seems to threaten, and the now emergent libertarian anti-political, anti-aversive style. If operant techniques worked, they would, I think, largely end or limit acting out in public life. I don't think there'll be a lot of rewriting of constitutions under the democratic rituals. I think instead one would reinterpret their meaning. Legitimacy and democracy would carry on. I think they'd mean something different. They'd be experienced differently simply in the new lifestyle of the culture. And a good example of this is what happened to the British monarchy. that it now means something diametrically different from what it did in the time of George Washington. Because the British monarch is now not an authority. The monarch is a bung or a blocking piece which is put there to prevent another person or persons from preempting a position of power, like the commander-in-chief or the one who appoints and fires judges. You can preserve institutions and titles to guarantee a power vacuum, and we may see that happening here. There are some contexts in which it would be uneconomic to apply this sort of thing, and I think we'd end up with a mixed society, with operant conditioning confined to fields where it's necessary to substitute cooperation for coercion and free enterprise, and to substitute intelligent purpose for play therapy in office. And that may need some blocking mechanisms. I'm not going to talk about Marxism. Normally, Marxists have always claimed that when you get a revolution like this, it represents the emergence of a new class. I think there is possibly a new class emerging, but it's not easy to define. And the new class is going to be the constituency, which consists of those who are now getting aversive vibrations, rather than the sort of platoon of Skinner's fixers, who would be the operant conditioners. I don't know whether you call these people neo-proletarians, the people who have nothing to lose but everything. Whether they're workers or intelligentsia, I think is a bit beside the point. They do represent a new dispossessed constituency which is acquiring power. A psychoanalytic criticism we shall have to encounter is that there's no reason to suppose that, since goals are not implicit in this, operant conditioning would be any less liable to be irrational than any other present system. There is a rather important point here, and I say this as one who accepts both the psychoanalytic and the operant paradigms as two different ways of looking at the same behavior. And that important thing is that these techniques introduce this anti-aversive sieve. If you have a program which rejects aversive behavior and rejects hostility, it is very remarkably able, I would expect, to exclude psychopathic people and acting out projects. We've got no other system which does quite that. And there is the fringe benefit also, of course, that if you had a vogue of wholly unaversive education, many people would expect this to, if not totally remove neurotic behavior, it would at least to reduce it in amount.
The deep difference, I really think, is between the disputants in this whole argument is whether operant conditioning provides us with the full explanation of our human actions. Donald MacDonald, executive editor of the Center magazine. Cali let me lie, killed and authorized the killing of a number of innocent, defenseless women and children. Now, a lot of us have read books and long articles about the circumstances that obtained at that particular moment when that action was placed. It became something like what C.S. Lewis called pockets of morality. We act a certain way when we're within a certain pocket of morality. And when we're soldiers, we use certain language in a certain way, use obscenities. When we move out of that pocket in a different one, we act a different way. Now, at Cali, apparently there was a sanction for that kind of action in that war, for that kind of behavior, which was perceived as at least okay. It certainly wasn't considered by Cali and others as being wrong. But the interesting thing to me is that some other soldiers were in that same situation, or in that same, according to C.S. Lewis, that same pocket of morality, and they didn't kill women and children. They revolted and reacted against it. They walked away from it. Now, somehow, one must be able to explain why those circumstances and all those referent conditions operate on one person one way and one person another way. And if the theory holds up, everybody should have acted more or less the same way. Everybody should have acted as Lieutenant Calley did. In other words, the conditioning isn't the full explanation of human action, at least in those circumstances. I don't think it is. The operant conditioning.
You're putting too much emphasis on the current situation and not on the past history of the individual.
Professor Skinner.
They were in similar situations, but they
brought
had
different histories.
Very different past histories.
Their past conditioning was different.
Well, this is begging the question to explain it that way. I don't think anyone can explain it at the moment, but I don't think it's a threat to this interpretation. I think you could show how, if I am right, we could give an explanation simply on a hypothetical sort.
I wish to make a sort of general futuristic forecast, and I make the following assumptions.
Arvid Pardo, now speaking, is the former ambassador from Malta to the United Nations.
That operant conditioning is scientifically valid and that it works 100%. That it is used and that it is applied at the macro level for the solving of general problems of society. Let us assume this, And let us see two situations. One situation in which one society adopts these techniques and other societies do not, and another situation where different societies adopt these techniques for different purposes. Assuming that one society adopts these techniques and others do not, I would on the whole tend to believe that these techniques would tend to undermine the flexibility with which man has confronted different contingencies throughout his long history. In other words, they would tend to restrict the range of effective options available to man in that society as compared to other societies. Now, this restriction of the range of effective options may eliminate certain errors. They may improve matters in certain ways, and thus give a competitive advantage to the society adopting these techniques. On the other hand, it, as I say, reduces the flexibility, and hence the society adopting these techniques would become less able to meet unforeseen contingencies. The people would not be adapted to meet those contingencies, unless, of course, the operant conditions had already foreseen them, which is rather unlikely. And hence, the society would become less competitive, and probably in the long run would have less prospect of survival in the very long run, although in the short run it might have some competitive advantage. Let us assume that all the world, all the different political societies in the world adopt operant conditioning techniques. In this case, we would have a number of competitive societies competing and using these techniques for different goals. And I would submit that this might increase the divisiveness of the world, because now the divisiveness is, to some extent, subject to the different poles of political debate, the different attempts to convince each other of the rightness of one's cause, and so on and so forth. In other words, it's left more or less to the individual. In this case, it would be systematic techniques conditioning each society to believe that its goals were predominant, and with results that could deepen the differences in the world.
It seems to me Ambassador Pardo's argument is a plausible one.
Norton Ginsberg, Dean of the Center.
That is, this scenario has particular merit.
See why there shouldn't be, on the part of any reasonably intelligent policymaker, a program for retaining a pool of diversities in any given population so as to supply a resource for social lability.
Joseph Schwab is professor of education at the University of Chicago and a visiting center fellow.
We even have the mathematics on how much of this we'd have to do, given commitments about the probability of novelty in the near and middle futures. So that we needn't take the premise that there had to be a monolithic program and policy for any given society or nation.
I think, Arvid, is perhaps assuming that we do not now have operant conditioning, and I would have thought that this is the way in which cultures already differ. The culture already does condition us to behave, say, differently from the Chinese or the Russians.
I think there's a very important issue that we have to at least throw out on the table.
Dennis Paragas, assistant professor of political science at Stanford University.
And that is the lack of trust, I think, that we have in ourselves. We have been conditioned from the beginning. We just didn't know too much about it until this particular juncture in history. We have been conditioned, now we're beginning to understand how it works. And I think we do not yet trust ourselves. We're still caught up in this old paradigm in which it's better to be laissez-faire about it and not understand the environment than to try and understand the environment and do something with these conditioners. Now, I would make the opposite argument. I would say that the more we learn about how the environment has been impacting us, the stronger the culture would be, because then at least we have some sort of leadership that's capable of doing the manipulation that's necessary to adapt the social organism to any threat that might arise. The more we know, the more we're capable of keeping the culture going.
I wanted to address myself to Ambassador Pardo's statement about lack of flexibility.
Vitaly Ryzenko is project director of the Operant Behavior Modification Project at the Mendocino State Hospital in California.
One of the emphases of operant conditioning is a reduction of punishment. At the present time, of course, our culture is punishment-oriented, and we tend to use this practice automatically, or much more automatically than we would wish. In international relations, I would suspect that punishment is a part of the armamentarium. I think what operant conditioning tries to do is open up other alternatives to punishment. I think that if we had a child and we were living on a busy street and the child runs out in the middle of the street, we would, on the basis of the survival, have to punish the child to make sure that the child would survive. So I don't think that operant conditioning closes the door or reduces the alternatives available, but rather increases them. Finally, operant conditioning engenders a different kind of looking at the world. That would mean looking automatically at the consequences of one's action, which is essentially is an immediate feedback mechanism. Whereas now we look at the motivations and whatever is going on internally, we would look at the consequences, and in that way would be much more able to adapt to changing situations.
Well, Ambassador Pardo, has the situation been clarified?
Not completely to my satisfaction. I would just say that a pigeon who has been told to recognize a red square and he pecks that red square, and he's perfectly conditioned. He's set in freedom and he looks for a red square and pecks it and nothing happens. Now, either he starves or he reconditions himself to a free life. The same thing in jail. Discarding the verbiage, the purpose of the jailers is to make a person perfectly adapted to the condition of living in jail. And the more successful they are, the less adapted the person is to live in another environment. The same thing with regard to an educational institution. The more perfect the teachers are in adapting you to absorb the educational process in whatever system, the less adapted you are to live in a different environment. Of course, operant conditioning is a very old thing. But what I think Professor Skinner advocates is to apply everything more logically, more systematically, more comprehensively, more effectively. And what is now a network of countervailing forces would become, in the ideal, rather monolithic. You would be conditioned to function in a certain way, in a certain manner, under certain contingencies. And when confronted by different contingencies, you would be confused. The operant conditioner would have to recondition you if he could.
Well, there's one point which is related to what the ambassador's been saying, which hasn't been touched on, and this is the extent to which behaviors are linked.
Robert Rosen, professor of theoretical biology at the State University of New York in Buffalo.
I tried to touch on this a little bit in my own paper. Sometimes in behavioral literature that I've been exposed to over the past weeks, the discussion goes as if behaviors were discrete atomic things which could be reshuffled and recombined without affecting each other. At other times, this isn't assumed to be the case. For example, the reason that aversive conditioning is supposed to be bad is precisely that behaviors are linked, that bad things come along with the suppression of the behavior that the aversive conditioner wants to suppress. Now, in the evaluation of consequences of any kind of technology like this, one of the things which is going to have to be analyzed is these systemic aspects, the extent to which behaviors are linked with each other, the extent to which they are atomic, can be treated as if they're atomic, and the extent to which a particular behavior, once conditioned, carries along unexpected other kinds of behaviors, which may be of an advantage or may be of a disadvantage. This bears on the irreversibility question of conditioning. Another question which is related to this has to do with what I could call the energetics of conditioning. The literature, as I understand it, says that anything can be conditioned if you put enough energy into it. In other words, if you want to, say, condition somebody to close a sphincter or control some smooth muscle fiber, you can do it, provided you spend enough time and effort on it. So in a sense, there is a correlation between the amount of energy you have to put into conditioning a kind of behavior and the complexity of that behavior. This would lead to a rule of thumb that the only kinds of behaviors you could condition at large with a small energy input per individual would be very general sorts of things which are liable to be linked with many other kinds of things. In other words, you can't be very selective about the kinds of things you're going to condition at moderate expenditures of energy. So there are two aspects. One of them is the linkage of behavior, how far they can be treated as if they were atomic, discrete, independent elements. And second, this question of energetics, which relates to the social efficiency of evaluating consequences.
I'd like to ask Dr. Skinner if he'd care to comment on 2 points that I can state very briefly indeed.
Robert M. Hutchins, chairman of the center.
One is suggested by the title of a current television show, from which I derive all my reinforcement, which is the real Fred Skinner. That is, the book is apocalyptic. The book says, here we are in this dreadful mess, and all we have to do is operantly condition ourselves and we'll be okay. That, I admit, is a caricature. Fred Skinner says here, where he is positively reinforced by our friendly manner, that we just got a few leads here on some subjects that look fairly important, and just leave me alone and I'll give you some information that may be useful to you in the future. I don't see the two Skinners clearly, and I don't know which is which and why there are two, if there are two. The other question is, are we now to assume that all questions can be answered by the method of experimental science?
Well, first of all, as to which Skinner I am, I wish I knew. I'm afraid that I can't establish my identity or give you my credentials even any better than I have done. I certainly don't feel we can answer all questions. I hope that is clear. But I do feel we have a technique, a methodology, a set of concepts which will help us advance toward answers, and I would say answers to any type of question that may be asked. I admit the inadequacies of an operant analysis. I do not admit that there are areas in which it is not of potential value. Two questions I do want to comment on briefly. One about the genetic endowment. I thought that Mr. Jensen was quite fair in reviewing my pronouncements in that field. He seems to feel that my colleagues or disciples or students are less likely to be explicit about this than I am, but I have never questioned the enormous differences among members of the human species. I did point out yesterday that pigeons have done things in the last 25 years they've never done before, and I made some statements about species differences being less extensive than they were once thought to be. And I would hold this to be true of human beings as members within a single species. I don't believe that by applying operant techniques of education, for example, we will reduce the differences between people. We'll move everyone up into a new level of achievement, but I should imagine that the actual absolute differences might even become greater, because I suspect that a proper education of a bright student would advance him far more than the proper education of a dull one, so that the original difference, yes.
Don't you have to reduce differences?
Harry Ashmore, Center President.
If you're conditioning everybody to the same set of values?
Oh, not at all. That bothers me, this idea that somehow or other we are working toward a regimented society in which individuality is not respected. There is no, so far as I can see, no threat whatsoever to the individuality of every member of the human species. Genetically, we are as individual as our fingerprints, every single cell in our bodies, and our individual histories are perhaps even more diverse. So there's no question of a tendency to deny individuality. This is a problem, of course, for technique. What?
We just may not like the kind we get. Like the curious thing about the discussion on the genetic thing is that Herrnstein, who is a student of yours and in the operant conditioning tradition, comes to very many of the same conclusions that Jensen would come to from a genetic standpoint.
Oh, yes, and I accept Jensen's position here, and it doesn't bother me in the slightest. I was going to review 2 experiments in which operant techniques have considerably revised what the ethologists have had to say about the innate behaviors of organisms. I do rather like the picture I painted in Walden 2, in which, if you remember, there were very bright people and there were also some very simple people. But in such a world, everyone finds something to do appropriate to his abilities and can enjoy life. And I should like to think that the world at large could be something along that line. The other issue I did want to mention is the question of goals. I thought that the last half of my book was concerned with that, with values, with the goals toward which a culture is moving and how we can arrive at them. And I really believe that a scientific analysis, and let's put it that way rather than saying an operant analysis, will have something very relevant to say about the prediction of the contingencies of survival which a culture is going to meet, and of the design of the behaviors which are most likely to permit a group to meet those contingencies. I really feel that the devices by which a culture brings its members under the control of a predicted future is extremely important. As far as I can see, it will require an operant analysis to arrive at them. I do want to end by expressing my appreciation for the Center for arranging this conference. It has been extremely valuable to me, and I don't mean in the flippant sense of being reinforcing to me. I have been reinforced, and if you invite me to come again, I shall be much more likely to come than I should have been otherwise. But your behavior has certainly shaped and modified mine. There are some things that I won't try to say that way again. There are certain things I am more likely to say that way again. There are certain areas I am more likely to keep on talking in, and other areas which I am much less likely to talk. This is, I think, as it should be, and I am convinced, as I was not before I came, of the value of the dialogue.
You have been listening to one in a series of programs recorded during a conference held to discuss with Professor B.F. Skinner the theories developed in his best-selling book, Beyond Freedom and Dignity. This program originated at the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions in Santa Barbara.